The day Eleanor
Please, can you
Whitmore
fix
bet her
it?
finest
It is a
stallion
broken
against
axle,
a
ma'am.
broken wagon,
Fix it,
half the
and I will
county
give you my
was
horse.
there to witness
Then we
it.
have a deal.
The annual Ranchers Festival was the biggest event of the season. Horse breeders, ranch owners, investors, and families from all over Texas had gathered at the Whitmore Ranch for the yearly horse auction. The main attraction that afternoon was Thunder, Eleanor's legendary black stallion. The horse had won competitions across the state and was worth more money than most people earned in several years. Everyone wanted to see him. I wasn't there for the auction. I was there to deliver hay. My name is Jacob Miller, and at that moment I was just a dusty cowboy unloading bales from an old trailer while wealthy ranch owners discussed bloodlines and investments nearby. Then the trouble started. Just as Eleanor prepared to lead a ceremonial parade through the festival grounds, her family's historic wagon suddenly collapsed. One wheel locked, the axle shifted, and the entire wagon tilted sideways in front of hundreds of spectators. Mechanics rushed over. Blacksmiths examined the damage. Workers crawled underneath with tools. Nobody could figure it out. The longer they worked, the worse it looked. Frustration spread through the crowd. Then Eleanor noticed me standing nearby. She smiled, folded her arms, and jokingly pointed toward the wagon. "If you can fix that wagon, I'll give you my finest stallion." The crowd burst into laughter. Even some of the workers laughed. After all, what chance did a small-town cowboy have if experienced mechanics had already failed? I didn't laugh. Instead, I walked over and crouched beside the damaged wheel. For a few seconds, I said nothing. I simply looked. Then I noticed something, a tiny detail hidden deep inside the wheel assembly, something nobody else had seen. And in that moment, I realized the wagon wasn't broken for the reason everyone thought it was. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 42 years old, and most people around these parts know me as a cowboy. Not the kind from movies with polished boots and perfect hats. I'm the kind who wakes up before sunrise, fixes fences with his own hands, hauls feed in an old truck that should have stopped running years ago, and spends every day trying to keep a small ranch alive despite mounting bills and constant repairs. My ranch sits about 20 minutes outside town on land that has belonged to my family for 3 generations. It isn't large. It certainly isn't wealthy. The barn roof leaks whenever a storm rolls through. Half the equipment I use is older than I am. My tractor breaks down so often that I sometimes think it enjoys causing problems. Most months feel like a balancing act between paying debts, feeding livestock, and hoping nothing expensive decides to stop working. But it's home, and more importantly, it's where I'm raising my daughter. Emma is 8 years old, and she loves horses more than anything else in the world. Not toys, not television, not video games. Horses. She knows the name of every horse on our ranch. She talks to them as if they're old friends. She spends hours brushing them, feeding them, and reading books about famous racehorses and ranch legends. If you ask her what she wants to be when she grows up, the answer changes every week, but somehow horses are always part of the plan. Some days she says she wants to be a veterinarian. Other days, a horse trainer. Once she told me she wanted to own the biggest ranch in Texas. I told her she'd better start saving her allowance. She laughed and said she'd just borrow my truck. Moments like those remind me of Sarah, my wife, Emma's mother, the woman who should still be here. 6 years ago, cancer took her from us. Even now, there are mornings when I wake up expecting to hear her voice in the kitchen. There are moments when Emma says something that sounds exactly like her mother, and for a second it feels like time moves backward. But it never does. The night before Sarah passed away, I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand. Emma was asleep nearby, curled up in a chair with a stuffed horse she refused to go anywhere without. Sarah looked exhausted, but she still managed to smile. She squeezed my hand and asked me for one thing, just one. "Promise me you'll take care of our little girl." I promised. Then she asked something else. "Promise me she'll always know she's loved." I promised that too. Those promises became my entire life. Every fence I repair, every extra job I take, every sacrifice I make, it's all for Emma. Which is why I couldn't stop thinking about the stallion Eleanor Whitmore had jokingly offered me. Thunder, the most valuable horse in the county, maybe even the state. A horse like that could change everything. I could sell him and erase most of my debts, repair the ranch, replace broken equipment, create a future for Emma that I could barely afford to dream about. Or maybe, knowing Emma, I'd never be allowed to sell him at all. She'd probably fall in love with the horse before he even stepped off the trailer. The truth is, I wasn't thinking about winning a bet. I wasn't thinking about impressing Eleanor. I wasn't thinking about proving anyone wrong. I was thinking about my daughter. Because standing beside that broken wagon, staring at a problem nobody else could solve, I suddenly realized something. If I could fix it, that stallion might completely change Emma's life. The wagon wasn't just an old piece of equipment, at least not to the Whitmore family. To most people standing at the festival, it looked like a beautifully restored antique wagon with polished wood, brass fittings, and decorative details from another era. But to Eleanor Whitmore, it represented something much bigger. The wagon had belonged to her great-grandfather, the man who founded the Whitmore Ranch more than a century earlier. It had led cattle drives, appeared in local parades, and been present during some of the most important moments in the family's history. Every year the wagon opened the Ranchers' Festival. Every year, Eleanor personally rode in it during the opening ceremony. And every year, hundreds of people gathered to take photographs beside it. That was why its sudden breakdown created such chaos. The moment the wheel locked and the wagon tilted sideways, panic spread through the festival grounds. Employees rushed over. Mechanics arrived carrying toolboxes. Blacksmiths examined the metal fittings. Even a restoration specialist from Dallas, who happened to be attending the auction, volunteered his opinion. Everyone had a theory, everyone had a solution, and every solution sounded expensive. One mechanic insisted the entire wheel assembly needed replacement. A blacksmith argued that the metal hub had become warped with age. The restoration expert claimed the wagon should be completely disassembled and rebuilt from the frame up. Each estimate became more complicated than the last. Thousands of dollars, weeks of repairs, specialized parts, custom fabrication. The crowd listened as the experts debated among themselves. Meanwhile, the opening ceremony was rapidly approaching. Eleanor's frustration became impossible to hide. The festival schedule was falling apart. Guests were waiting, investors were arriving, and nobody seemed capable of solving the problem. That's when she made the joke about giving me her finest stallion. Everyone laughed, everyone except me. Because while the others were arguing, I was watching, listening, observing. Years of ranch work teach you something valuable. The biggest problem isn't always where people think it is. Machines are like people. Sometimes the obvious explanation is the wrong one. I crouched beside the wagon and began examining it carefully. The wheel certainly looked damaged, but something didn't feel right. The wear pattern was wrong. The angle was wrong. The resistance didn't make sense. I moved to the opposite side, checked the axle. Nothing. At least nothing serious enough to cause this kind of failure. That immediately caught my attention, because if the wheel wasn't the problem, and the axle wasn't the problem, then what exactly was everyone looking at? The mechanics continued discussing expensive repairs. The blacksmith pointed at metal components. The restoration specialist talked about structural weaknesses, but none of them seemed interested in asking the most important question. What caused the failure in the first place? I lowered myself into the dirt and looked underneath the wagon. For several seconds, I simply studied the mechanism. Wood, metal, bolts, brackets, fasteners. Then I noticed something unusual, a tiny irregularity, so small that most people would never notice it. At first glance, it looked insignificant, almost meaningless. I leaned closer. The more I looked, the more certain I became. My heartbeat slowed. Not because I was nervous, because I had finally found the clue. The problem wasn't the wheel. The problem wasn't the axle. The problem wasn't the wagon at all. It was a single tiny component hidden deep inside the assembly. A part so small that nobody had bothered to inspect it. A part worth less than a cup of coffee. A part worth only a few cents. And somehow, that insignificant little piece was responsible for everything. The moment I found the problem, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so simple. Around me, mechanics were still debating expensive repairs. The blacksmith was convinced the metal hub needed replacement. The restoration expert was talking about rebuilding half the wagon. Employees stood nearby, waiting for instructions, while Eleanor watched everything with growing frustration. Meanwhile, the answer was sitting right in front of them. Hidden, ignored, overlooked. I reached beneath the wagon and carefully brushed away years of dirt and grease. Then I saw it clearly. A small bent nail. Nothing more, nothing less. The nail sat deep inside a wooden guide bracket that helped keep the wheel assembly aligned. At some point, decades earlier, someone had used it during a repair. Maybe it had been a temporary fix. Maybe it was all they had available at the time. Whatever the reason, the nail had remained there ever since. For years, it caused no problems. Then time did. What time always does. Wood shifted. Metal expanded. Pressure accumulated. Little by little, the bent nail forced the mechanism out of alignment until the entire wagon finally failed. The amazing part wasn't that it had broken. The amazing part was that it had survived this long. I looked up. Eleanor folded her arms. "Did you find something?" I nodded. "A nail." The crowd laughed. Several people actually laughed out loud. One mechanic shook his head. "A nail?" The restoration specialist smirked. "That's impossible." I didn't bother arguing. Experience had taught me something important. People who are absolutely certain they're right rarely listen anyway. Instead, I reached into my toolbox. The replacement cost less than 6 cents. A simple steel nail. Nothing special, nothing rare, nothing expensive. I removed the old bent nail and carefully inserted the new one. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. The crowd watched in silence. Most of them expected failure. Honestly, I think some of them wanted failure. After all, if a simple cowboy fixed a problem that experts couldn't solve, what would that say about the experts? I stood up, wiped the dust from my hands, then stepped aside. "Try it." Nobody moved. Finally, Eleanor nodded to one of her ranch hands. The man cautiously approached the wagon. He grabbed the wheel, turned it. The wheel rotated perfectly. No resistance, no grinding, no locking, no problem. A few people frowned. The ranch hand pushed harder. The wheel continued turning smoothly. The wagon rolled forward, then backward, perfectly. For several seconds, absolute silence covered the festival grounds. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the mechanics seemed frozen. The only sound came from the wagon itself, rolling as smoothly as it had decades earlier. Then the shock hit. Whispers spread through the crowd. People stared at the wagon, then at me, then back at the wagon again. The restoration specialist looked genuinely confused. One mechanic removed his hat and scratched his head. Another simply walked over and examined the wheel for himself. Eleanor stood there, speechless. The woman who owned the largest ranch in Texas looked completely stunned. Finally she laughed. Not the polite laugh from earlier, a real one. "You've got to be kidding me," I smiled. "Nope. A 6-cent nail. Looks that way." The crowd erupted into conversation. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Others looked embarrassed. But while everyone else was reacting with surprise, I noticed something different. Across the festival grounds, near the horse auction area, one man wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't impressed. He was angry. Very angry. His jaw was clenched. His eyes locked on me. And for reasons I couldn't yet understand, watching me fix that wagon seemed to be the last thing in the world he wanted. At that moment, I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. But something told me our paths were about to cross. And when they did, a broken wagon would be the least of our problems. A promise is a promise. That was Eleanor Whitmore's first response, after the crowd finally recovered from the shock of watching a 6-cent nail solve a problem that dozens of experts couldn't. The festival continued, the opening ceremony was saved, and by late afternoon people were still talking about the wagon. Some laughed about it. Others argued about it. A few refused to believe it. But the facts were impossible to ignore. The wagon worked, and I had won the bet. Part of me expected Eleanor to find a polite way out of it. After all, Thunder wasn't just any horse. He was the pride of the Whitmore Ranch, a massive black stallion with a flawless bloodline and a championship record that made breeders across Texas dream of owning him. The horse was worth a small fortune. Far more than my ranch, far more than my truck, probably more than everything I owned combined. Yet the next morning, Eleanor kept her word. When I arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, Thunder was already saddled and waiting. Several employees stood nearby. Even they looked surprised. Eleanor handed me the lead rope. "You won." I stared at the horse, then at her. "You're serious?" "I made a bet." I couldn't help laughing. Most people would have changed their minds. She smiled. Most people aren't Whitmores. For a moment, I honestly didn't know what to say. I had spent most of my life working for everything I owned. Now I was standing beside one of the finest horses in Texas because of a 6-cent nail. The first person I thought about wasn't myself. It was Emma. She was going to lose her mind when she saw this horse. And I was right. The moment Thunder stepped onto our ranch, Emma practically exploded with excitement. "Dad!" She ran across the yard faster than I'd ever seen. "Is that really him?" I laughed. "Looks like it." She spent the next hour talking to the stallion, brushing him, petting him, and asking questions I couldn't answer fast enough. To my surprise, Noah became just as excited. Over the following weeks, he visited often, sometimes with Eleanor, sometimes with ranch employees. The two children quickly became inseparable. Emma adored Thunder. Noah adored Thunder. And somehow the stallion seemed to enjoy having both of them around. At first, everything appeared perfect. Then I started noticing small things, very small things, the kind of details most people overlook. Thunder occasionally favored his left rear leg. Not enough to limp, not enough to draw attention, but enough for someone experienced with horses to notice. His reactions during training also seemed unusual. Certain movements made him nervous. Certain commands caused hesitation. At first, I assumed it was stress. After all, changing ranches can affect any horse. But the more I watched him, the more uncomfortable I became. Something wasn't right. One afternoon, while brushing Thunder near the barn, I found what finally confirmed my suspicion. A scar, small, hidden beneath his coat, positioned in a place that should never have been injured. I examined it carefully, then found another and another. My stomach tightened. These weren't accidents. They weren't normal training marks. Someone had been handling this horse improperly, possibly for a long time. That evening I shared my concerns with Eleanor. She looked shocked. "That's impossible." "I wish it was." Her expression changed, slowly, from surprise to concern, then to anger, because if Thunder had been mistreated, it raised a much bigger question. Who had access to him? The list wasn't long. A handful of trainers, several employees, and a few trusted managers, people Eleanor had relied on for years. The next morning, Noah and Emma were feeding carrots to Thunder when I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. The same trainer responsible for the Stallion had also been assigned to maintain the historic wagon. For several seconds, I stared at the records in front of me, then at the trainer's name, then back at the records, because suddenly the broken wagon didn't look like bad luck anymore. And the more evidence I uncovered, the more certain I became. The wagon's failure wasn't an accident. Someone had made sure it happened. The moment I started connecting the pieces, I knew I was looking at something much bigger than a damaged horse and a broken wagon. Accidents happen on ranches every day. Equipment breaks. Animals get injured. Mistakes are made. But what I was seeing wasn't a series of accidents. It was a pattern. And patterns were something I understood very well. Long before I became a full-time rancher, I spent 12 years working as a Texas Ranger. During those years, I learned that people can hide lies, but they struggle to hide patterns. Sooner or later, the same behavior appears again. The same shortcuts, the same motives, the same mistakes. As I reviewed maintenance records from the Whitmore Ranch, one name kept appearing over and over again: Victor Kane. At first, it didn't make sense. Victor wasn't a ranch hand. He wasn't a mechanic. He wasn't a horse trainer. He was a wealthy businessman, a family partner, a trusted advisor. And according to most people in the county, he was also the man most likely to eventually marry Eleanor Whitmore. On paper, he looked perfect, successful, educated, influential, the kind of man newspapers loved to photograph, the kind of man investors trusted, the kind of man Eleanor's business partners respected. But the more I dug into the records, the less perfect he appeared. The trainer responsible for Thunder reported directly to a management company partially controlled by Victor. The contractor who maintained the wagon had recently received unusually large payments, approved through Victor's office. Several repair reports had been altered. Maintenance schedules had mysteriously changed, and every trail somehow led back to him. The evidence wasn't enough to prove anything yet, but it was enough to make me suspicious. Very suspicious. A few days later, Eleanor invited me to review additional documents inside the ranch office. The deeper we looked, the worse things became. What started as a simple investigation into wagon repairs quickly uncovered financial irregularities, then contract irregularities, then land agreements, then supplier payments. Every new document revealed another problem, and every problem pointed toward the same person, Victor Kane. For years, he had positioned himself as Eleanor's most trusted business partner. Meanwhile, he had quietly expanded his influence inside the ranch operation. He approved contracts, managed partnerships, controlled investments, negotiated supplier agreements. On the surface, it looked like loyalty. In reality, it looked more like control. The breakthrough came when I compared several maintenance reports with financial records. One contractor had billed the ranch for repairs that were never completed. Another had charged premium prices for replacement parts that were never installed. Several invoices appeared completely fabricated. Millions of dollars had slowly disappeared over time. Not enough to attract immediate attention, but enough to build a fortune. Eleanor stared at the documents in disbelief. How did I miss this? I understood her frustration, because that's how people like Victor succeed. They don't steal everything at once. They steal a little at a time. They build trust first, then they hide behind it. But money wasn't the only thing Victor wanted. The more we investigated, the clearer his real objective became. He wanted Eleanor dependent on him. If the wagon failed publicly, she would appear unprepared. If Thunder's value declined, she would lose credibility among breeders. If ranch operations struggled, Victor could step in as the trusted problem solver. Every crisis increased his influence. Every failure strengthened his position. And if he eventually married Eleanor, he would gain access to one of the largest ranching empires in Texas. The wagon, the horse, the contracts, the missing money. Suddenly everything fit together, like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a picture. That evening I sat alone on my porch watching the sunset, while Emma brushed Thunder near the barn. Noah was helping her. The two kids laughed while the stallion calmly stood between them. For a moment it looked peaceful, normal, but I knew better, because the evidence sitting inside my truck was enough to destroy Victor Kane's entire reputation. And the moment he realized we were getting close to the truth, he wouldn't sit back and watch. Men like Victor never surrender quietly. They fight, they lie, they manipulate, and sometimes they become dangerous. What neither Eleanor nor I knew yet was that Victor had already discovered we were investigating him, and he was preparing his next move. The annual Ranchers Association meeting was packed. Word had spread throughout the county that something important was about to happen. Ranch owners filled every seat. Business partners lined the walls. Reporters stood near the back of the room. Even people who normally had no interest in ranch politics showed up out of curiosity. At the center of it all sat Victor Kane, calm, confident, smiling, at least at first. He still believed he controlled the situation. He still believed nobody could prove what he had done. What he didn't know was that Eleanor and I had spent weeks gathering evidence, contracts, invoices, maintenance reports, financial records, emails, everything. The moment Eleanor stepped onto the stage, the room became silent. She spoke with the same confidence that had made her one of the most respected ranch owners in Texas. But this time, she wasn't presenting business plans. She was presenting the truth. One document after another appeared on the large screen behind her. The audience watched closely. At first, the evidence seemed confusing. Then the pattern became clear. Missing funds, fake invoices, manipulated contracts, unauthorized payments. The whispers started almost immediately. People looked toward Victor. Victor stopped smiling. Then Eleanor called my name. I walked to the front of the room carrying a folder filled with documents. Most people knew me as the cowboy who fixed a wagon with a 6-cent nail. Very few knew about my years as a Texas Ranger. Very few knew how much time I had spent investigating fraud. I explained the timeline, the wagon sabotage, the mistreatment of Thunder, the manipulated maintenance reports, the financial schemes. Piece by piece, the entire story came together. Every road led to the same person, Victor Kane. The room grew louder with every new revelation. Anger replaced confusion. Shock replaced curiosity. Then came the final piece of evidence. The document Victor never expected us to find. A payment authorization bearing his signature. directly connected to the contractor responsible for sabotaging the wagon. The room exploded. People stood up. Questions were shouted. Reporters rushed forward. Victor's face turned pale. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he stood. The confident businessman everyone admired was gone. All that remained was a desperate man surrounded by evidence. "There has to be some mistake," he said, but nobody believed him. Not anymore. The proof was overwhelming. The truth was undeniable. Years of manipulation collapsed in a matter of minutes. The entire town witnessed it. The businessman who had spent years trying to control the Whitmore ranch was finally exposed, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. When deputies escorted Victor from the meeting hall, complete silence filled the room. Then slowly, people began applauding. Not for me, not for Eleanor, for the truth. After the meeting ended and the crowd dispersed, Eleanor found me outside near the parking area. The sun was beginning to set. For a moment we simply stood there watching the last light stretch across the Texas horizon. Then she smiled. "You know something." "What?" She laughed softly. "I never thought a 6-cent nail would save my ranch." I couldn't help smiling. It wasn't the nail. She looked at me. "What was it?" I glanced toward the distant fields. It was paying attention. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she nodded, because she understood. Sometimes the biggest problems aren't hidden behind complicated answers. Sometimes they're hidden inside the smallest details. Later that evening, I drove home. As soon as I pulled into the driveway, I saw Emma standing near the barn. Beside her was Thunder, and beside Thunder stood Noah. The two children were feeding the Stallion carrots while laughing about something only they understood. The setting sun painted the sky gold and orange behind them. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, simple, right. I leaned against the fence and watched them, Emma smiling, Noah laughing, Thunder calmly standing between them, and I realized something. That day, I didn't win a stallion. I didn't win a bet. I simply noticed what everyone else ignored. Sometimes the smallest things change everything. If you had been standing there that day, would you have bet against the cowboy? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, courage, horses, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.